Hey everybody, Stephen from Safeways today. Wanted to talk for a few minutes about harness inspection. While using a harness is vitally important, so is the inspection process to go through to make sure the harness stays in good working order. There's two types of inspections you should be doing. One should be a daily inspection by the user, and the second is a documented inspection by a competent individual other than the user. What I'd like to do today is walk you through an inspection of actually a used harness. We'd like to thank Mr. Garcia for donating his. And we want to start first and foremost with the labeling of that particular harness. Every harness should be labeled, and while having a label is important, so is the legibility of that label. So this particular harness that I'm going to be inspecting today is our FS 185. The labeling of this harness is actually on the back torso straps. Once you open up and you find the label of your particular harness, what you're going to be looking for is a couple pieces of information. One is going to be legibility across all aspects of that information, and then the second is the specific standards that this particular harness meets. And you want to be able to make sure that you can understand and see and read that standard. In this particular case, I open this label up, and what I immediately see is the standard that this harness meets. However, I notice some slight blurring of this label. That could be due to use, it could be used to the elements, or the actual cover that's over the top of that label. However, the label is still legible, so as a result, I would say pass for legibility of this particular label, but in a notes section, we would say that we'd like to go back and make sure that we pay special attention to that at the next inspection. Another thing that I open up is that I can see pertinent information relative to the manufacturer. I see pertinent information relative to the date of construction of this harness. Also, what I want to make sure of is that I understand the history of this harness, meaning when did it first go into use and prior inspections done. That can happen in a couple ways. It can happen on the label itself. However, it is not required to be on the label itself. The important piece that we have is that we have some level of documentation either with the harness or in some other place that we can see when the harness went into service and how often it has been inspected. Now, one question that we get, and probably the number one question that we get about harness life is there a life expectancy of a harness, or is there a required life on a harness? And many times we call this the 5-year rule. What we want to point out is that the life of the harness is based on how well it's taken care of, how it is used, and of course, how it is inspected. There is not a 5-year rule on a harness. If you'd like some more information on this, please visit safeways.com, look under our FAQ section, and we give information about that. So after we've taken a look at the label, there are several other aspects of the harness that we want to pay special attention to from an inspection standpoint. One is fall indicators. Not every harness has a fall indicator, but most do. Why is that important? Because it's an indication of the trauma or the force that the harness has been exposed to. In this case, this harness indicator has not been deployed, so it's in good shape. As we move past labeling and past the indicator, we want to start talking about the hardware. Any metal pieces that are on this harness. This happens to be a single D-ring grommet leg harness. What we're looking for on those metal pieces is we're looking for any cuts, nicks, deformities. We're looking for any special corrosion, anything that could cause that piece of metal on that harness to interfere with the use and application of the harness in a fall. So in this case, I'm going to work from the top down. I'm going to start with my D-ring. What am I looking for? I'm looking for any deformity in this D-ring that could change the shape of it. I'm looking for any corrosion on this D-ring. I'm looking for any burrs or nicks that could create a sharp edge. In this case, this D-ring is in very good condition. As I work my way down the front, I then come to the chest strap, which again is a metal piece. This happens to be a mating buckle chest strap. And what am I looking for? Again, those same attributes of the D-ring. The burrs, the nicks, the deformity. It's very important that I can mate this particular one together so my hardware goes together. Then as I work down on this particular harness, we have some friction adjusters here. We want to make sure that they're working properly. We want to make sure you can still adjust the harness. We want to make sure that there's no dirt or corrosion or anything that impedes that harness from being adjusted properly and being worn properly. As we work our way further down the harness, we happen to have here a tongue buckle or grommet leg harness. Now, one thing I like to do with grommet leg harnesses, I like to use my index finger and my thumb, compress that grommet on both sides and try to turn that grommet. Most people may not realize that this grommet is a two-piece apparatus that comes together on the webbing. So I want to make sure that it is seated well on both sides. So I take my thumb and my index finger, and I then spin that grommet, and I spin every grommet on both sides of the leg, right and left, to ensure that they are not moving. If I find that those grommets do move or spin, and that means they're not seated well, I will remove that particular harness from service. Again, this harness appears that the grommets, the buckles, the D-ring, and the chest strap are in very good condition. Also, with a grommet leg harness, we want to make sure that our tongue billet actually, again, is not deformed. We want to make sure that the harness, the two pieces can go together, the male and female end, and that they're going to seat properly. The last section we want to talk about regarding harness inspection is webbing and stitching. Harnesses, for the most part, are textile-based products. So we have a lot of webbing on this harness that we need to be looking at, and there's several things that we need to be looking for. First and foremost, we want to think about cuts and burns and holes on this webbing. Depending on the kind of work that is being done, maybe it's welding, maybe it's grinding, maybe it's working around sharp objects, that can cut this webbing, it can fray this webbing, it can burn this webbing, or holes could be put in this webbing. So we're looking for, as we run our hands along this, we're looking for those frays or cuts that could damage the integrity of the harness. Second thing is we're thinking about burning. And when I think about burning, I call it the scab effect. In other words, I may find a black piece of welding spatter, or I may find a burn, or what I think is a burn mark on a harness. And by simply taking my fingernail and pulling at that, sometimes that piece of char will come right off. If it does, and there's no structural damage under that webbing, then I move on. If there is structural damage, that could be cause for either a failure, depending on the severity, or if it's just a very slight surface tear, then we would note that. The next thing that we want to look for is paint and chemicals that get on the harness. Now, harnesses are used in a number of dirty environments, so they will be and can be dirty. However, the best way to check for paint and chemicals on a harness is obviously by looking at it, but what is best is looking at webbing pliability. Webbing that has absorbed a lot of a certain chemical, or specifically paint, will become very unpliable, very rigid. So the way I test that is about every 6 inches along this webbing, I am moving and bending this webbing, looking for pliability. The more rigid that webbing is, perhaps the more material it has absorbed. And a rigid harness that doesn't flex and doesn't bend as you bend it probably needs to come out of service. Excessive wear. These are used in a variety of environments. Heat, cold, etc. And over time, this material will wear. So as we think about pliability on webbing, we also want to make sure that the webbing still has some level of structural integrity, and it doesn't feel thin, or it doesn't feel so pliable that it could almost come apart, okay? And that will happen over time depending on the environment. Excessive wear could also be an area that's unprotected from a wear indicator, where two pieces of webbing are rubbing together. You could be wearing down a piece of that webbing. So we want to make sure that we are looking for that excessive wear. And then the last piece we want to look at is heat and UV damage. The best indicator of high heat UV damage is a severe discoloration of the harness over time. That means it's been exposed to a tremendous amount of sunlight, and it has actually impacted the coloring of that harness, and you'll actually see that deformation happen in color to where the harness doesn't maybe take on a high-vis green effect anymore. It's more of a white effect. Stitching. All of these pieces and parts, the metal, the webbing, etc., are all coming together. And so we want to check the stitching, not just on the particular harness, everywhere that's put together, but also in the accessories of the harness. So what am I looking for in stitching? I'm making sure that there's no frays. I want to make sure that there's no stitching coming apart. A question I get a lot about stitching is, well, how do I know if I see where this stitching has been trimmed, if it's still okay to be used? You simply pull on it and ensure that that stitching is not further coming apart, because this is a point of connection within this harness. Now, this particular harness has a shoulder pad. So when we think about stitching and we think about material, we do want to pay attention to the padding of the harness. And if you'll notice on this particular harness, there is some wear in the shoulder pad area of this harness. However, if I pay careful attention to how this harness is put together, this particular shoulder pad is what we call an ergonomic feature, or an ornament piece of this particular harness. So we notice that there is some excessive wear here. We notice there is a little bit of tearing here. but structurally it's not impacting the performance of the harness. So in this case, for this particular harness, I would definitely note the excessive wear that's on the ergonomic shoulder pad of the harness. I would not personally fail that harness. However, that note that I make during inspection allows me, the next time that I inspect this, to pay a little bit more attention to that shoulder pad, like we're going to pay a little bit more special attention to that label, to ensure that the harness is still performing as it did the last time that we inspected it. Inspections are so important to fall protection. It's important to have the equipment, but it is important to maintain the equipment as well. We appreciate you listening. Hopefully you picked up something from this video.